I was the only human in Professor Zethus's advanced xenobiology class, and I had already learned to ignore the stares. They were not cruel stares. The Velhari students with their 4 pale, translucent arms would glance at me the way someone glances at an unusual stone they found on a path. Curious, briefly fascinated, then moving on. The Grenith, coral-colored and slow-blinking, would sometimes lean a little too close to examine the small scars on my forearms, the ones I had collected growing up on a planet that treated childhood like a test you were not guaranteed to pass. None of them meant harm. To them, I was simply strange, a curiosity, something that did not quite belong in the same room as beings whose home planets had gentle weather, mild predators, and gravity light enough that their bones had never needed to grow dense. Earth, according to the galactic census, was a threat class 7 Deathworld. It was not a title anyone had given us as a compliment. Mara Sundin sat 2 rows ahead of me. She was from northern Sweden, built like someone who had argued with winter her entire life, and won every round. She had grown up hunting with her father in temperatures that turned breath into crystals, survived 2 avalanches before she turned 19, and had hands that could crack the lid off a vacuum-sealed specimen jar without any visible effort. She was also, without question, the most precise and careful student in the room. Her lab technique was clean, her notes were thorough, her instincts were sharp in the way that only comes from years of paying close attention to things that could hurt you. Professor Zethus did not seem to notice any of this. He was Velhari, ancient by their standards, with arm sheaths faded to near white and eyes that had watched more than 3 centuries pass. He was brilliant in the way that very old, very accomplished beings sometimes become, genuinely knowledgeable, and also entirely certain that his way of understanding the world was simply the correct one. He had a theory, never stated directly but always present in the air around him, that peaceful home planets produced sharper minds, that beings who had never needed to fight the land beneath their feet had been free to develop finer thinking. He never said this clearly enough to be confronted, but I had been in his class for 8 months, and I had a memory sharpened by the same evolutionary pressure he looked down on, and I had noticed everything. The pauses before he answered human questions, the way he called on Velhari students first, always, as if their hands had risen before anyone else's even when they had not. The one time he had said, in a tone meant to sound kind, "For beings of your environmental background," and then moved on as though he had given a compliment. Mara had noticed too. She had told me after class one afternoon, her jaw set in the particular way it got when she was deciding whether something deserved her anger. "He thinks we are less intelligent because our planet tried to kill us," she said. "He is wrong," I replied. "Yes," she said simply, "he is." She was not the kind of person who spent energy on bitterness. She simply kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept performing at a level that should have been impossible to overlook. That was her way of answering him, not with words, with results. The practical session began on a Tuesday morning. We were analyzing live microorganic samples collected from 4 different planetary surfaces, learning how to handle biological material from high-threat environments without allowing contamination to spread into gentler ecosystems. It was careful, methodical work, the kind Mara was particularly good at. She had positioned herself at her station before anyone else, her tools already arranged in exactly the order she would need them, her hands steady and unhurried. Professor Zethus moved through the room in the way he always did during practicals, slowly, deliberately, stopping behind students to observe their work, and then reaching past them to demonstrate corrections. It was his signature teaching method. You would feel him behind you before you heard him, that long shadow falling across your station, and then his arm would extend and adjust something you had been doing correctly, as if the act of correcting was the point, rather than any actual error. He stopped behind Mara. I watched because I had learned to watch. She was isolating a microbe sample from Karoth 4, an ocean world with temperate biology. Her technique was exactly right. I could see it clearly from where I sat. The extraction tool was angled correctly. The pressure was appropriate. Her hands, those hands that had processed animals in subarctic cold, were perfectly controlled. There was nothing to correct. There was no error. Zethus watched her for a moment. Then he made the low tonal hum the Velhari produce when they are about to demonstrate something. He reached forward, and he slapped her hand. It was not a hard strike. By his standards, it was barely anything at all. It was the kind of contact that in old Velhari educational tradition meant stop. You are doing this wrong. Pay attention. A correction delivered through touch, because touch, in Velhari teaching philosophy, was more immediate than words. He had probably done it 100 times over his long career without thinking about it. He was already turning away before her hand had finished moving. The room went completely still. I have tried to describe what happened next to people who were not there, and I always struggle with the same problem. It did not look violent. It did not look like anger. It looked, more than anything, like physics, like a very simple equation being solved. Mara turned. Her hand came up and closed around his wrist. This was not a decision she made. She told me this later. In the quiet and honest way she talked about things she needed to understand. Her body had simply responded to being struck. That was all. 8,000 years of human survival pressed into a reflex so deep it had no name. When something hits you, you reach back. Not to hurt, just to stop it from happening again. Her grip closed around the four-jointed Velhari wrist. Shathis made a sound I had never heard before. He pulled back. That was the mistake. She had been holding, not pulling. She had not been trying to break anything. She had been trying to hold something still. But he pulled against her grip, and the angle was wrong, and the leverage was wrong, and his wrist, designed for a world where nothing had ever needed to grip hard enough to crack a vacuum seal, was not built for what happened next. The fracture, the medical report would later confirm, occurred in 2 places. The room stayed silent for 4 full seconds. Then everything moved at once. The lab assistant ran for the door. 2 Greneth students stepped backward. Someone dropped a specimen tray. Mara was looking at her own hand, as though she was examining it for information, her face calm in the particular way that meant she was working very hard not to feel anything yet. "I did not mean to," she said, to no one in particular. I reached her first. "I know," I told her. "I know." The disciplinary hearing was scheduled within 48 hours. The language in the initial filing used words like unprovoked and endangerment and cross-species incident, words that described the shape of what had happened, without describing any of its substance. Mara was placed on restriction while the review board assembled. No lab access. Supervised movement through the station. I filed my testimony the same evening. I was not alone. Reth, a Greneth student who had been studying human history as a linguistics elective for 3 years, submitted a careful document noting that the Velhari slap correction method had been formally retired from Velhari educational institutions 50 years earlier, precisely because of incidents like this one, in cross-species settings. The gesture had been appropriate once, in a time when Velhari taught only Velhari. It had not been appropriate for decades. Jathis had simply never updated his methods. Lene, a young Velhari student in her first year, submitted something that, by Velhari standards, was remarkably direct. She had been uncomfortable with the atmosphere in the class since her first week, she wrote. She had assumed she was misreading cultural signals. Looking back now, she did not believe she had been misreading anything. My own testimony was the longest. I had spent 8 months in that classroom, with the kind of attention that Deathworld environments produce in living things, the awareness that misses nothing, because missing something on Earth can mean not going home. I had not consciously intended to keep a record, but I had one anyway. Every pause before a human question was answered. Every practical session where human students were assigned to secondary stations. Every moment of the slight, careful condescension that had never been large enough to point at alone, but had been constant, like a low sound always present in the background that you only noticed when it stopped. I submitted all of it. The review took 3 weeks. Every day felt long in the way that waiting feels long when something important is being decided in a room you cannot enter. Mara spent most of it in the common room the 11 human students had claimed from a converted supply closet. We had a coffee maker, 2 mismatched chairs, a small porthole that framed a piece of deep space beautifully, and a dying succulent named Gerald. She drank coffee and read, and did not talk much, which was how she processed things that mattered to her. The board's final report was thorough. The slap correction was formally classified as inappropriate cross-species contact and an unauthorized use of physical pedagogy outside approved academy guidelines. Professor Jathis was suspended from teaching duties and required to complete a mandatory cross-cultural competency review. The report noted that the method he had used was not only outdated, but had been specifically flagged in cross-species educational guidelines as a practice that could not safely transfer between cultures, and that a faculty member of his experience had an obligation to know this. The charge against Mara was expunged. The board classified the injury as an unintended mechanical outcome resulting from mutual force application, which was the most precise and honest description of what had happened. He had struck her. Her body had responded before her mind could intervene. He had pulled against a grip designed by a planet that does not produce weak grips. No one had intended the result. The Academy also commissioned an audit of all 11 human students' academic records. This had not been part of the original complaint. Someone on the board had seen my testimony and decided the question was worth asking. The audit took another 2 weeks. When the results came back, they confirmed what Mara had suspected, and I had suspected, and probably all 11 of us had suspected, without ever saying it aloud. 3 students had been systematically undergraded, not dramatically, not enough to fail anyone or destroy a career, just enough to push marks down slightly in ways that could always be attributed to something else. Subjectivity in assessment, differences in communication style, the kind of gap that never looks like bias when you examine any single instance, but becomes unmistakable when you look at the pattern. Mara's marks in Jethis's class had been running 12% below her objective assessment scores, 12% for 8 months, because of where she was born. She did not say much when I told her. She looked out the porthole for a long time. Gerald sat on the windowsill between us, looking worse than usual. "Are you angry?" I asked. She thought about it in the careful way she thought about everything. "I was angry a long time ago," she said, "before any of this happened. I have been angry since the 3rd week of class." She turned her coffee mug in her hands. "I think I stopped being angry and started being tired." I understood that. "You know what I keep thinking about?" She said, his arm. "I keep thinking that I did not choose that. My body chose it before I could." She paused. "I do not want to be something that reacts before it thinks. I want to be something that gets to decide." This felt like the most important thing anyone had said to me in a long time. There is a version of this story that is about strength, that ends with humans proving themselves to a galaxy that underestimated them, with a dramatic moment that demonstrated something impressive, with a lesson learned by those who doubted us. That version is not wrong, but it misses something. The thing the galaxy keeps misunderstanding about humans is not our strength. Strength is easy to document. The galactic census had already noted it, in clinical language, in the same breath they used to classify our world as dangerous. What they had not found a way to record was this. The reason we survived a world that should have killed us was not only that we were strong, it was that we were strong and still, every single day, chose to try to be careful with that strength. To be gentle with it when we could. To regret it when we could not. Mara had grip strength that could fracture alien bone. She also spent 3 weeks, quietly troubled by an accident she had not chosen, wishing she had been able to decide differently, working out how to be better. That combination, that is the thing. Professor Jathis completed his review and returned to teaching the following semester. I heard from a second-year student that he had become notably different in the classroom, more careful, more genuinely curious about the students in front of him, rather than the categories he had placed them in. People can change. It does not always happen, but when real accountability arrives, and a person is honest enough to receive it, sometimes something real shifts. Mura graduated at the top of our cohort. Her final project was a contamination protocol framework for handling biological material from high-threat environments across species lines. It was adopted as standard academy curriculum 6 months after she submitted it. She dedicated it simply to the idea that strength and care are not opposites. Gerald died. We bought another succulent and named it Gerald II, because some things deserve continuity. The stars continued being enormous and indifferent, and full of possibility. And somewhere out there, a galaxy of gentle world beings was still slowly learning what we already knew from the inside. We did not survive Earth because it was easy. We survived it because we refused, every single time, to stop.